Here in the Northern Rockies, dark winter months are outlasted in basements, dens, and nooks where kindred souls gather together to share intel, swap fly patterns, and relive the memories from seasons past. This gathering spot, known locally as the February Room, is the inspiration for this podcast. No matter the season, the door is always open to those with a fly fishing story to tell. Brought to you by CD Fishing USA, the North American distributor for composite development fly rods and accessories. 40 years of Kiwi ingenuity and graphite technology now available at cd-fishing.us or your local CD USA dealer. Follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. And remember to go fishing. Here's your host, the Carnops, and this is the February Room.
In trout country, the northern pike is an oft-maligned character accused of high crimes in watersheds where the two overlap. But not all fly anglers harbor this sentiment. There are those who appreciate the pike as a fly rod game fish and a savvy predator that tests an angler's skill, knowledge, and experience. They say 10% of the fishermen catch 90% of the fish. And in terms of pike in western Montana, I believe this adage holds water. My guest today certainly resides in the upper echelon and is widely regarded as the regional authority on pike on the fly and fly tying. Neil Cote, welcome to the February Room.
Justin, thanks. Thanks for letting me be here.
Yeah, absolutely, man. This is going to be fun. I can't wait to pick your brain. But before we take a deep dive into all things pike, do you have a fishing story you can share with us? Pike or otherwise?
This year, yeah, I actually have a pretty good one. I was a couple weeks ago. I was fishing down at Knox, and I was actually not fishing for pike, fishing for walleyes. And I should have brought a surfboard from where I was. It was 3-foot, 4-foot waves, and not a single shred of it was Mother Nature oriented. It was pleasure boats, wakeboard boats. I had one boat that I guarantee it threw a 6-7 foot wave.
Wow.
It's pretty crazy. The really crazy thing was, though, we were catching fish, so we just kind of stuck with it. The kid that I had with me was kind of complaining on the fact that he's from California and he hasn't seen waves like that since he's been out on the ocean a few years ago. So,
man, yeah, this year it's been crazy
it's been
busy out there.
I did fish the water that you and I fish up at Sealy a couple weeks ago.
And?
I caught a northern pike with a brand new Thomas cyclone in the corner of its mouth.
So
it had just been bitten off. I mean, that lure was, I think it still had the price tag on it. Right? I mean, it was brand new, and that pike had zero problem smoking a fly right after.
Yeah, I've had a couple of days like that this year where it's just been crazy with pleasure boaters, man.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's been kind of the year to hit it early and pick those times.
Yeah.
When the wave runner and jet ski and Mountain Dew decal boats. I don't know where all these people are coming from.
What were we calling it? Flow tube hatch. That's what it was.
There you go.
Flow tube hatch. And now you go on the lakes. It's a terrestrial wakeboard hatch. But anyway, yeah, it's pretty crazy. So
it makes it hard to fish in that stuff in my little skiff.
I think yeah, exactly. The reason why I caught that fish, though, believe it or not, was I actually went to take my boat out, and there was so many people putting in that I could not, like at the Big Larch at the boat launch there, I had to wait an hour and 45 minutes just to be able to get my boat onto the dock, drive up, then wait in line for probably 15 minutes, 20 minutes to get my trailer in the water, put the boat on the trailer and get out of there. So it's pretty crazy.
Well, I might as well just go.
Well, that was what we
make
did.
Some casts.
We kind of were like, okay, we'll just go out here. And of course, I'm cheating because I'm using the crest liner with the spot lock mid-coda, so I can just go out there and go, okay, I'll spot lock here and fan cast this, and went to one spot, caught 2 fish, and I'm like, oh, that's not too bad. Moved over about 75, 80 feet, re-spot locked it again, caught 3 more, and then I had lost 1 fish that was a good-sized fish, probably in the 40-inch range, surprisingly. Yeah, I was not expecting one of that caliber, 100 yards from the boat launch, right? But I have caught multiple large fish within sight of where everybody puts in. So I have a habit of fishing water that people don't fish.
It's a good habit.
And that's there's a big flat there, and I was fishing it. And there was another guy that I had talked to that was there, and he was like, he goes, yeah, we fished the inside of that. And I said, well, did anybody fish the outside of it? And he looked at me like, why would you do that? And I'm like, well, we got 30 minutes to kill, or at least I thought it was going to be 30 minutes, not the hour and 45 minutes, but we fished the outside edge. I think we ended up getting, between the two of us, we got 15 or 18 fish. So
dang,
wasn't too bad.
No,
so,
I wouldn't say that was bad at all, man. That's the key to any fishing, whether it's pike or otherwise, is just to, like you said, hit the spots that everybody else kind of overlooks and misses.
Well, and everyone has a misconception. Well, they have multiple misconceptions. People think that pike are, 100% a warm water fish. And I believe they are until they hit that about probably 30, 32-inch size. From 32 to about 36, those fish all of a sudden are more like trout. Their water temp preferences are more like trout. They don't like 70s, they like 60s and 50s. Trout do the same thing. The bigger trout get, you don't see trout, a lot of times, like, all of their lives, once they break that, that mythical 24, 25-inch mark, coming up and sipping little tiny, dry flies all their lives. They start to find the niches that they can find food sources that are, considerably easier to catch, number one. And then number two, they get more caloric intake from them. So they purposely will target that stuff. Once those pike get to be 40 inches, they are no longer a warm water fish, except when they want to spawn in the spring. The rest of the time, I so rarely see those large fish super shallow after probably the 15th, 20th of June around here. And it's it runs, like I go to Coeur d'Alene quite a bit and fish Lake Coeur d'Alene and a couple of lakes over there. I fish the Pinderay because it's a few fish in that system. Flathead River, same thing. It's kind of that, once that water temp hits mid-60s, those fish are no longer on those shallow spots. And, like this year, it was great. We had a pretty wet spring, which saved us. But that held fish on those flats up until, probably almost the end of June this year, almost into July. But that was the exception to the rule. But yeah, those bigger fish are, their temperature preferences go way down, that you catch them in places that like I said, that you'd actually, when you fish the rivers around here, like a lot of the stuff that you'd fish for trout, probably harbor one or two big pike in some of those systems, in some of those places, and people just fish right over the top of them and say, oh, no, we're not back in the corner in the frog water.
Right.
So they go right by it. A lot of the fish that I've caught out of the Bittert and the Clark Fork have been in places, especially, that were out on current seams where you'd be fishing for trout, not where you'd be way back up in the shallows fishing for, up in that, way back in, I'm getting ahead of myself, way back in that super shallow water.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of guys kind of, row right over fish to get to where they think they need to be, as opposed to fishing the water, fishing their way in and fishing their way back out. So that's one of those things that, you mentioned it earlier. That was one of the things, if you're fishing water that people aren't fishing, you'll catch more fish that way. So
sure. And kind of what is that temperature range you think that those bigger fish head into during the heat of the summer?
I would say like high 50s to mid 60s, right? There's a 10 degree temperature range in there that those fish are the most active. After that, those fish will still remain active, but they'll search out locations that they can find that water temp, right? So they will drop off on deeper weed beds. Like we fish up at the lake quite a bit, like Sealy and salmon. And I'll see those bigger fish drop off, weed edges. So they're not in that 10, 12 feet of water. Now they're 15, 18 feet of water. Up to, 25, 30, and even 40 feet of water. And the other thing that I have seen a lot is that they will orient like a weed bed, where if you go up and you see the weed bed and you go, okay, I just need to fish the edge of this weed bed. That fish could be 30, 40, 50, 60 feet out off of that weed bed, like even with the tops of the weeds, but suspended out away from that.
Oh, okay. So that's his ambush spot, getting some cool water.
Yeah, so everyone has this thought process, like you go in, fish the weed bed, oh, there's no pike on the edge, there's no pike in the weed bed, let's move to the next one. Sometimes those fish will set up, 20, 30, 40, 50 feet away from that edge. And it'll be about the depth. The way that I find them a lot is I'll go up and either use my electronics, because I'm a fishing nut, so I got everything on the boat, right?
Sure.
So I'm using my side finder, looking out. I say, okay, there's a weed bed, there's a few fish there, and I'll kind of every once in a while glance, put my side finder on and glance out to see if I can mark a fish. And more often than not, you'll pick up one or two of those fish that have just moved off that edge. And with those lakes thereafter, they've got kokanee in those systems, they've got peamouth, they've got squawfish, they've got a whole bunch of different open water kind of species. So instead of those fish targeting, up in the shallow water, targeting perch and whatever comes in that weed bed, they'll slide out and kind of play that game where they can suspend up and then look up. Anything that swims over the top of them, they come up and get it. And, you pike fish, how hard they are to see.
Yeah.
In the weed background.
Yeah.
Put them over 40, 50 feet of water where it's super dark. It's really hard to pick up that fish sitting down there, looking up like a white shark at a seal, waiting for something to come out and swim over the top of them. And it gives them a huge feeding advantage that way. So those fish that are in those locations are usually 100% on. They're not off. Whereas you'll find fish on those weed edges, they get fished a little bit. You see them, and they won't follow, or they'll follow, but they won't eat.
Right.
And a lot of times that's where they've been harassed a little bit. They know better. I always joke, we used to always call it I want to follow that fly up to the boat and see if it's attached to a boat.
Right.
And I've had that happen a lot where I have big fish that'll follow right up and go, oh, yeah, there's a boat attached to that. I'm not eating that today. And off they go. So.
Cool. And then you're a bit of a hybrid angler too. I mean, you're a fly fisherman, but you'll throw hardware too. And when those fish get into that deeper water, are you generally switching over to terminal tackle?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yes and no. Terminal tackle will allow you to cover that water, hugely effectively. I mean, you can, I do it with bait casters, a big swim bait, a big rod, and I can fan cast. I can throw casts, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 feet easily, right, with repetition. But there are places like Coeur d'Alene Lake is one of the ones that I have done incredibly well on super large fish with flies. I have not done great on swim baits there. I've had a lot of big fish follow swim baits there, but I think it's because I think they see them more than they do over here. The other thing that's funny is that you can get locked into a speed and a cadence. I mean, we all do it like fly fishing. You get used to, like when you're stripping streamers for trout, you're like strip, pause. You kind of get it where you do two, then one, then two, then one. You kind of keep doing the same thing, right? I have found with those fish, for some reason, they do want a big, slow-moving bait, so a bigger fly. And it's got to be like where, you can strip it and then suspend it where it'll just stop. And I've had a lot of my strikes on those larger fish where I've literally stripped 2 or 3 times, waited, go to strip again, and I don't feel a fly. And the bad thing is I don't know how long it's been since that fish has probably come up, inhaled the fly, swam 2, 3, 4, 5 fish lengths towards me, and I don't even realize that the fish has already eaten it. It's already come up, taken, and repositioned to try and take something else, right? I don't even know if the fish has taken it, so it surprises you a lot of times, right? That fishery is incredibly weird in the aspect that there are some very large fish in that system that don't abide by what I would consider pike rules, right? They do stuff. I mean, I fished up there in that place where I'm fishing in 2 feet of water, and every huge pike is in 2 feet of water. I'll go there a week later and I won't find a huge pike anywhere inside of 12, 15 feet of water. I don't know what it is with that place. I don't know if it's a water temp deal. I don't know if it's a wind deal. Those fish just do weird stuff. But the other place is very similar to a north end of Flathead Lake. Very similar.
Gotcha.
Those fish are in places that, you can go. If you want to fish it with 10,000 casts in Montana, I've got the place for you. However, if you do get one to eat, it's probably going to be giant.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear you say that because I've been playing up there a little bit and I have not cracked the code whatsoever. But I wanted to ask you about this because do you know, are there tiger muskies up there?
No. The only tiger muskies in Montana are placed by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. I've had a few guys. I had one gentleman that was very adamant about the fact that he was catching tiger muskies and he was sending me pictures. This is 2-3 years ago. They were all pike. Most of them were juvenile pike that he was catching, right? And there's usually anywhere from 2 to about 5 different color ranges in pike that I have seen. He was catching a lot of them that they didn't have the spots per se. They do. They're still there when you look close, but it did have the tiger stripe markings, right? And that was kind of one of those deals where, tiger muskies are incredibly different fish. They like warmer water. They pull more of the musky characteristics as opposed to the northern pike characteristics. Easy way to tell is looking at the pores underneath their chin, counting pores. You can also look at their head designs, just slightly different. Muskies have a more duck-billed head.
Mm-hmm.
You look at it down from the top, where pike have a little bit more tapering. Their jaw structure tapers a little bit more to a point, especially their upper jaw, where muskies are just really, looks like a duck-bill when you're looking at it from the top down. So
Right. So we were up pike fishing on the north end of Flathead, and we saw this critter come up several times, and it was up on the surface, and its head was poking out of the lake.
Musky stuff, yeah.
And I'd read that tiger muskie will do that, and they don't know why. It was baffling. My buddy and I saw this thing like 4 or 5 times, and it looked like a big pike that was coming up and swimming with its head sticking out of the water for probably 20 or 30 seconds, and then it would disappear, and then it would pop back up somewhere else
and do it again.
And do it again. Yeah.
I have seen northern pike do that. They do
you
say
have?
that muskies.
Okay.
I have seen northern pike do it. I have seen muskies do it as well. They used to say that it was for they can gulp air, so they'll gulp air into their stomach. Sometimes it's just to expel something, right? They get something that's making them sick, so they're sucking air in to try and get it in, and then they'll spit it out, and that's what causes them to kind of come up to the top. They suck in air in their stomach. And then I have seen fish. I saw a fish actually not there, but up in Bennon Slough, which is further up the system. Someone had caught the fish and released it. I don't know. I'm pretty sure the fish died, the fish that I saw, but it was kind of doing the same thing where it would swim for 20, 30, 40 feet at a time with its head just up breaking the water, and then it would disappear for a little bit, and then it would come back up and then disappear. So I don't know. I don't know. That fish that you guys saw could have been one of the ones that maybe got, either got released or was gulping air. I know muskies do that quite a bit too.
Interesting. Yeah, I had no idea that was even an Esox behavior. And then I was reading something about tiger muskies and came across the tidbit that said that, yes, tiger muskies have been known to come up and swim on the surface. So then I thought,
well, gosh, maybe.
That's interesting.
I see a lot of that. I see a lot of pike around here, pre-spawn pike that do that. They'll come right up below the surface. They're trying to warm up. And they'll come within, their dorsal fin will almost be sticking out of the surface of the water, and they'll just be sitting there either cruising really slow or just stationary. Like, oh, there's one. And I have everyone that I bring fishing, like, that time of year, like, oh, there's one. Like, don't even throw at it. Why not? I go, it's off.
Yeah.
She's trying to warm up. She's, -4 on the scale of that she's going to eat something. You can drag a fly across it, put it on her bill, and she'll just turn and swim away from it. She won't even eat it.
That's what's so frustrating about pike fishing sometimes. People have this misconception that they're
eating machines, right?
Right.
God, I wish they were.
Yeah.
A couple of thousand fish that I can think of off the top of my head that I wish I could make them eat. They are, how do I describe it? They are one of the most frustrating fish on the planet. Everybody around here, they're easy. You can go out and catch them. Certain times of the year, they are stupid. You can catch them. You can have a very low knowledge level and smoke them without even trying, right? And then, 2 weeks later, you won't touch one. You'll see them, and they're there, and they won't touch anything. And it's just, that's more of a spawning thing where they're pre-spawn. That's another tidbit for everybody out there that, pre-spawn, post-spawn fish. Like in Montana, I always had everybody say, oh, they're done spawning in June. There's fish spawning in the river in March. We get water temps. Their water temp preference for spawning is from 44 to about 46.
Okay.
And you know it from taking temperatures in the rivers you've done. In March, you can see some of these sloughs that have, 3 foot, 4 foot deep flat at the end of them that are dark bottomed. And that water will be 48, 49, almost 50, right? And those fish, that's why those fish move to those locations to spawn, basically. And I fish super early in the year because I'm looking for those bigger fish to make that move to a pre-spawn location. So they'll move right to the mouth of said slough that we just described. They've had all winter where they haven't eaten a whole bunch. Their metabolism is starting to ratchet up, and they're looking for that last couple of good meals to kind of get everything to get enough energy to spawn. Because they haven't been harassed per se, they are incredibly gullible. So they haven't seen, they obviously haven't seen a Rapala in 3-4 months. They haven't seen, because rivers are closed for fishing for smelt in those times, they haven't seen a dead bait. They are 100% in a feeding mode at that point, and they will eat pretty much. I mean, it's super consistent. I mean, you can go out if you hit the right water temps, anywhere from 38 to about 41 water temp in that time of year, you're going to catch some huge pike. The other time is the fall time. If you start targeting fish in mid-October through November, even in December, you'll see some of those fish that are going into that are already starting to load up before they even go on the ice. If they're on lakes that are going to freeze, they will load up before that water temp drops way down and forces their metabolism down so they won't as much. But there's kind of those two big windows, and it goes against everything that everybody tells me. Everything that I read going through the book, say, oh, you're going to fish for pike, they're warm water fish, you're fishing shallow weeds. These fish are doing stuff that's entirely different.
Right.
And I joked about that. I did a lot of research on that. And then when I was, in the process of doing that, muskies, doing a lot of research on muskies. And muskies are they're a different fish completely. They do stuff. They can function in warm water. Those really big fish. I mean, this is, like this time of year is when they start really getting some huge muskies, right? And you don't see the guys that are out there doing that. They're in water that has both large muskies and large northerns in a lot of situations. And you don't see them hitting big northerns, but you do see them hitting those muskies because they can function in 70, 71, 72 degree water temps. Those bigger pike don't function in those, that water temp real well. So they'll drop off in the deeper water. I kind of personally, I don't fish for them once the water temp hits about 7. It's not that I can't catch them. It's just that I feel like those, especially the larger fish, you're hurting them, right? You're bringing them up. It's the same thing with the trout. When you do hoot owl restrictions, it's the same idea. Those fish, when you hook them, they're fighting. They're burning. They're filling their muscles full of lactic acid, and now you're bringing them from 60-degree water to 70-degree water. It's not. It shocks them, right? And you hear people say like they catch a big pike this time of year. And it's like, well, he didn't. She ran a couple of times, and then she got up on top, and she just kind of gave up, right? It's not that she's given up. She's basically in shock at this point. She's in such a warm water temperature, right? So I kind of purposely will back off this time of year. This year was the exception. You could fish considerably later. Water temps stayed cool up until probably about a month ago. Mm-hmm. Where normally I usually about the 4th of July is kind of where I start. There's other fish to chase and other things to do at that point. So, but kind of got off point there. I apologize.
No, not at all. Not at all. Good stuff, man. This is all, you're making this easy on me. I had all these questions written down, but you're just rolling, and this is great. So this is very inside intel that most of us weekend warrior pike anglers don't know and don't understand.
Well, like I said, it took me a long time. I shouldn't say that. Let me rephrase. About half of that was just accidental, as with all fishing, right? The big fish being out off those flats was kind of a deal. This was years and years ago. We were fishing at Salmon Lake when it had a bigger population of fish. And moving the boat, like, oh, we're going to move from this weed bed to that weed bed, and I've got to fly out the back of the boat 6 feet back, just dragging, right? You just stripped it in. I'm like, okay, I'll just put it in the water and I'll run out to this next weed bed. Halfway across, all of a sudden, I kind of looked back and the damn rod down there just yanked out of my hand, and I found one of those fish that was suspended out off a deal. And this was before I had all the electronics and everything. So I'm like, okay, note to self, if we're going to fish this weed bed, we probably want to not stop a cast length away from it, but maybe 2 or 3 cast lengths away from it.
Right.
Fan cast our way in and see if there are any fish out, off these edges. And sure enough, started picking up an extra fish or two. And I noticed, my brother noticed it, a lot of the guys I fish with, we all noticed that the fact that those fish that we would pick up off of those, 30, 40, 60 feet away from the weed beds were considerably larger fish.
That's where they were.
Yeah, than the smaller fish that we were picking up off these weed beds. And we kind of, we always call it, I don't know, you probably heard me say this. You can run numbers. So you can go up to the shallow water, you can catch all the small pike you want. A lot of fisheries, there's, usually a lot more small pike than there are big pike, right? And if you fish the weed beds, the lily pads, Cedar Lake's classic for it. You go up those lily pads and you can, find those smaller pike and get them with, frog patterns, top water, smaller streamers, anything that looks like a perch, they'll eat it. They're pretty aggressive. But you won't see any fish over maybe 30 inches.
Mm-hmm.
And don't get me wrong, they're fun as all get out because those little guys are 100% killing machines. They're up there for a reason. Water temp's high. Their metabolism's through the roof. I mean, their heart's beating like a hummingbird. They're eating everything that moves. There's two reasons why those fish are there. One is obviously because they're eating food, and two, because they know that if they come out off that edge,
they're going to get crushed.
A bigger pike's going to smoke them.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one of the other things that I always tell people with fisheries. I know a lot of people are against pike, right? They eat everything. And I said that's great, and it's true. When they're small pike and they're stunted, they most definitely will smoke everything, right? When we go into these systems and we fish them, if you kill these larger pike that are 35, 40, 45 inches, you're taking out the number one limiting factor to a pike population besides human beings.
That's a good point.
You're taking out these large pike that are specifically targeting small pike because they know.
Because they're easy.
Exactly. I mean, a small pike is going to sit on a weed bed.
A trout.
He's going to do something dumb. This bigger fish is going to come up to this edge and watch this little pike come out and try and smoke 2 or 3 small minnows. She'll just slide right up to on that edge and just look up and wait for him to make a mistake and come out. And one less little hammer handle on the planet. Bigger food source for her. She eats 2 of those a day. She doesn't have to eat anything else, right? She doesn't have to chase around after small minnows. So when I see people, and I see it all the time on Facebook, on Instagram, it's like, oh, I went up, caught this huge pike, threw it up on the bank. And it's like, well, one, that's illegal. You can't do that. It's a game fish.
Right.
Don't let Fish and Game catch it because, maybe they don't want the pike in there, but they will write you a ticket for wasting a fish. And number 2, you're doing the exact opposite of what you need to do to help that fishery, right?
Right. That's a great point.
I always see guys, these big pike eat all these trout. I've caught pike my entire life. I've caught some absolutely huge pike, and if I killed a fair amount of them in my younger years because I didn't know, didn't do the research. And filleting those fish out, looking at stomach content, started kicking me off. Like, okay, well, here's this huge pike, and she's got one small pike inside of her. She just ate. There's another one sticking out of her throat, right? And she's got a big crayfish and a whitefish in there. Mm-hmm. And the next one will have a big old dead, sucker that it found on the bottom. Mm-hmm. The next one will have 4 or 5 big crayfish. So these larger fish didn't have the trout in them. But when I do a lot of the surveys, I know when in the 90s when they took the dam out, when they were doing that study, right? They did a lot of stomach content studies, and I kind of would pay attention when they were doing them when I was putting them out fishing and talking to them. A lot of those smaller pike, sure enough, trout, whitefish, trout, squawfish, they had a lot of those smaller fish, that they were targeting. And they were surveying a lot of very small fish because they were catching their gill nets, right? And so they put out a deal. I know Brian Schmetterling put out a deal, saying that, this is what they're targeting. But he never really said in the study, this is what this size of pike is targeting for a food source. So everyone that would read that report would automatically go, okay, they're eating trout. We got to get rid of them. But what he didn't say was that, we don't have any large fish in the system at that point. And they didn't, because a lot of those big fish had gotten schwacked out of there. As soon as everybody found out there was pike in there, they went in there and killed a lot of those bigger fish.
Right.
So we saw a lot of them when they were in there spawning in certain places. You see a big female that's getting ready to spawn. She'd come in pre-spawn, and she'd have 4 or 5 of these little small males with her, right? And then all of a sudden you turn and look, and here comes that big female swimming by with a hammer handle, T-boned.
Yeah.
So she had to stop and get a meal before she continued on with what she was doing. We saw that a lot all of a sudden. We saw less big fish, saw more small fish, but saw those big fish turn them into a food source.
Interesting.
And I always joked, I've talked to Brian a few times in the future, and I always joked, it's like, I wish you guys could have done that study a little differently. And studied fish, by size class or year class, as opposed to just generically stamping them as a fish killer.
Yeah,
eat everything, right?
Exactly, right.
And I've noticed that over the years with the flies that I tie. I've tied a lot of rainbow trout pattern streamers, right? And I'll show them to people, and they're like, oh, that's the greatest thing ever. I've got a box full of them. I've probably only caught 10 fish on them.
They don't work. I did the same thing.
Put a big rainbow out there. They'll eat it. Yeah, no, they won't. They're not looking for it.
Right.
That was the thing that I ran into really fast. Was like, okay, they're not targeting trout per se. They were targeting whatever food source was super available to them. I started noticing the natural colored stuff, like whitefish patterns that look like a whitefish, squawfish, peamouth patterns, like more golds, more olives. That got more of them to go. And then, believe it or not, crayfish colored stuff, browns, a little bit of orange, a little bit of red, the greens with blue in it, like blue sparkle and stuff like that. Those fish, I don't know if it's because they're just geared towards doing that. They're used to seeing, okay, when I go and pick up this big crayfish on the bottom, he's dark black, but he's got orange somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So they're seeing that. The patterns that I have tied, and I tie a lot of them for people, and I sell a lot of them, and I tell every one of them when they buy the trout stuff, like, that's awesome. It looks like a trout.
Yeah.
That may not catch fish, just so you know. So,
right.
And I've had, I throw a yellow fly a lot that I call it the big bird, right? And I throw that pattern a ton. I tie that in about 4 different patterns. And that fly doesn't look like anything that's in nature. It's a big yellow, neon bright yellow fly, and that thing will catch more pike and even big pike, which surprises me because I never thought they'd target that stuff. But they do that in black. Black is a huge color, and I tell people that they won't buy them.
Right.
And I will catch a lot of big fish on black. I don't know what the deal is with that. And then I kind of, I said, then I'll segue back to, okay, whitefish patterns. That's been a big popular one for me, is that whitefish. I do know that a lot of guys were buying it for a while, not for pike.
Right.
They're buying it for bull trout.
Oh, sure. So let's talk about Bite Me Flies a little bit. So your company's been around for as long as I've known you, which is almost 20 years.
I think I actually started selling flies, I think it was 92 or 91.
There you go, almost 30 years, okay.
So, yeah, I've been doing it for a while, and I still got some of those flies, and I save them in a box, and I look at them and go like, oh, my God, what was I thinking?
They probably were.
Oh, they probably still work. They're probably perfectly fine. I know my brother used to do that because when I started really turning them out production line-wise, and when I say that, my production line's pretty small, my brother would come over to my house, and I'd have a box with all the ones where the head was glued a little bit off, or one of the eyes had drooped when I put the epoxy on it. I'm throwing it like, people aren't going to buy that. It doesn't look like the other 5 that are right there. So he'd come over every about, I don't know, mid-March and take that box and pick through it and get all the seconds and thirds, right? And he caught just as many pike as I did with stuff that was pristine and perfect. So
sure.
But yeah, no, I've been doing it for a long time. I got into it just because they started showing up in places, and I was a big trout fisherman. I was a fly guy, fished every day that I could. Fished Clark Fork, fished a bit at, whatever spot I had, at that point I was traveling all the way to going over to the land of the giants over in the Missouri, fishing all of that. And kind of just, did the pike thing as kind of a joke one day. I had a buddy of mine, I bet you can't catch one on a fly rod. Had a big trout streamer. I can't remember. I think it was a big yellow mother minnow, if I remember right, that I bought, I believe, around Bob Ward's, right?
Mm-hmm.
Boom, picked up a fish. Boom, picked up another one, bit me off. So I learned real fast that yes, they have teeth, and yes, 10-pound test mono is not going to stop that from happening. So I kind of, researched some stuff, started doing pre-made steel leaders, started making my own leaders at that point. At the time then, it was, just you had 7-strand
mm-hmm. leaders,
and now the world's your oyster. You got all kinds of different stuff, right? You can do fluorocarbon, which is what a lot of the guys do. I've experimented with it a whole bunch. I still lose fish to it.
Me too.
So
I fish wire. You?
Yeah, I went to titanium wire.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a couple of different companies that make, you can tie a knot and you can tie a clinch knot in it, right? So I can tie an Albright knot to a leader and then run, and the thing I learned real fast was that, a 12-inch leader will work great for all the small pike that you catch. Anything over about 35 inches, you're running the risk of having a fish that comes up and smokes that fly, and that bill's longer than 12 inches. Mm-hmm. She's going to freaking bite you off. I had a fish do that to me. This would have been probably 10 years ago at Knox, and fishing down there in the spring with my brother. Had a fish come up that was solid 45-inch fish. I never felt the fish take. I was saying something to my brother, and I turned while I was stripping the fly, and I went to strip, and there was nothing there.
Mm-hmm.
strip in, and I'm like, I come up, I got mono hanging off my fly line. Like, what the heck? Like, I didn't feel a fish take, and I'm like, God, did I nick it? You know, the fly or something? I can remember they go, look, 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 and he's pointing. I turn and look, and there's that fish swimming by, you know, a foot underneath the surface, and my fly is on her gill plate, just swinging around. So she had come up to inhale the fly, and when she did, it went right into her mouth and right out her gill plate.
Crazy, yeah.
And when she closed and turned, she cut the leader off like a pair of nippers does.
Right.
Dink. So I didn't feel the fish. Didn't even realize she'd eaten it. And saving grace, you want another fish story? Saving grace was that fish saw us in the boat and spooked. And when she spooked, that fly popped out and it sunk to the bottom, and I got it with a net.
You got the fly back.
So I got the fly in the leader.
No way.
And I remember I was looking at my brother in the boat, and I held up the leader, and I'm like, 12 inches is not enough.
Yeah, so that fly had been in through the pike's mouth, out the gill plate, and back into your fly box.
And I got it back in the fly box, and that fly caught another, I don't know, probably another 150 fish. And it ended up getting that individual fly with a longer leader this time. I ended up getting a 42-inch fish down there about 2 weeks later. So,
oh wow,
almost on the same spot, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't that fish.
So, in your flies, on to your point there, they're known for their durability. So, kind of tell me, like, how do you build a pike fly? What are the most important things, especially given how pike tend to eat a fly?
Well, the biggest three things I see guys do, they either put too big a head on them, right? So they're trying to cover stuff up, and I that's why I put epoxy heads on mine. To cover up a lot of the thread wraps that are underneath there, just because teeth, they're gonna tear a fly apart. If you do like a wrapped head and just do head cement on it and stuff, it'll hold up for a few fish. And I say this nicely, those flies will actually hold up on large fish incredibly well. It's the medium and small fish that are just destroyers of everything. You'll hear me say that a lot of times, like, so you're fishing for big pike, you go up to Canada and you fish big pike, you could literally probably do about 3 just half hitches and put a drop of glue on that fly and probably get away with fishing that fly a weekend.
Right.
If you go somewhere up there and you're catching small hammer handle pike, about 10 of them, and that fly is a hook shank with nothing on it. So I go in and I purposely weigh them, put different, lead wraps on them, and I do have different weights that I'll do. I'll do light, medium, and heavies. And then I'm, putting as much of the wrapping up underneath that head as I possibly can, so that when I epoxy it, it does give it that protection. And it's great protection until you bounce it off the side of your boat or hit a rock when you're casting, or your buddy. They'll break when you do that. But yeah, if you're careful, those flies will last a long time. But that was the biggest thing that I found from a durability standpoint, was that anything you can do to hide that thread from teeth, especially from medium and small fish, the more that fly will last.
Mm-hmm.
And the other direction that I have gone is I didn't go super into synthetics in the beginning, right? I did as much natural stuff as I could, and I say that nicely. I'm a bucktail fiend when it comes to that. Where I'm
sure,
I think I run into Justin here about half the time in the spring, where I'm literally going from fly shop to fly shop trying to find bucktails.
Yeah.
Because it's gotten to the point where you can't find a good one anymore.
Yeah, it's hard to find the big long ones.
Yeah, and unless you really want to spend about $10-12 a tail, you can do that if you go online. But it's one of those things where finding decent tails is difficult. But I tried to stay with as much natural stuff as I could. I just found that when I did kind of dabble in a lot of the super synthetics for especially like up near the heads, I just didn't catch as many fish with them. I don't know if they make a certain sound in the water when they strip, or if they just give that profile on it. And I'm more locked on the profile than the sound. And I'll segue into that sound thing in a little bit, because sound is a big thing for those fish. You got to figure a fish that's 3 feet long is using a lateral line that is designed to pick up vibration and water movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some flies that are out there that are tied like all synthetic, they don't make a lot of noise when you're stripping them through the water. You won't hear that swishing sound or the water coming through. So I stayed in natural stuff to get that sound, and I would trigger more fish with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing too, and I'm sure like the natural materials would hold scent a little bit differently, right? You don't have as much of your scent getting on that fly when you're fishing it. There's another one of scent that's fish that follow, and I've had flies that fish will follow and never eat. and then wonder why, and then take that fly. I mean, I've done it. I've literally done it where I've added scent to it. Right? You know, purposely either do, you know, smelly jelly or whatever scent's available. Goes from not catching fish to catching fish in one spray.
Right. And that could be why sometimes, like, when you're catching those smaller fish on the same bug, it just becomes like just, you know, one after another, because that fly smells like pike now. It smells like fish.
Who was it? It was Dave Whitlock that said that. Yeah, he had an article in one of his books about that years ago. And he used to take, like, if it was a woolly bugger, if it was a mother minnow, and he did a lot with mother minnows. I think that's what he was describing in his book. He'll tie that fly on. He'll walk to the bank and he'll grab a handful of mud off the bottom or sediment, put the fly in his hand, and just completely, you know, goose it up with whatever mud, sand, silt was there. Then he would fish the fly, and he always said don't try and touch it very much once you've done that. And his description was, and it was a beautiful description, he said, you know, you get a big brown trout that's fishing, that's living in a hole, and it comes up and it grabs something that it thinks is a minnow, and it bites down. And of course, that deer here crushes and crunches when that fish closes down. So it feels just like what a minnow would feel like, you know, when he's crushing down on it, crushing its skull or breaking its back. And then all that sediment comes out, the sand and stuff that's trapped in the deer hair that you just put on it. Fish tastes that, you know, it tastes the least amount of a triggering thing for a fish. But, you know, say you and I are standing there BSing on the bank and we're stripping that streamer, that fish is going to probably hold on to that streamer, you know, 10 or 15 seconds before, whereas if it didn't have scent and that stuff and it would come up, crush down, it would get that one thing, but then feel no other sensations. It wouldn't feel that sand popping out into its gills, right? Wouldn't taste the salt that was on it from doing that. So that fish would spit it out immediately. So if you're slightly distracted, you get a strike. You know, the longer that fish holds onto the fly, better chance you're going to get the fly stuck. So I've seen that with a lot of the flies that I did. That's why I stuck to the natural material, because it would do those things, right? And then hooks. Outsourcing hooks used to be difficult in Montana because nobody really fished for, you know, anything bigger than the size 2, right? And I'm putting, you know, 1/0, 2/0, 3/0. I've even got flies up to 6/0 and 7/0 now for hooking gaps. And that was more gaps because of the material that I was putting on them, just to get that ability to hook fish. And I do something a little bit different than a lot of guys do. I purposely keel bend mine, and I tie them with kind of the hook point up as opposed to the hook point down.
Okay.
And the reason why I did that was obviously you lose enough flies on wood and rocks in these rivers with that hook down, you know, because if you get it near the bottom and you strip it into a rock, it's going to stick right in. So I reversed that hook shank to get that hook point up so that I could fish it closer to the bottom and closer to weeds and structure, and not have as many of them get wedged into something and lose the fly. The other thing I found was that hitting a pike in that upper lip gave me a lot better hooking percentage than it did in that lower jaw.
Okay.
Because when you think about it, when you look at a pike's face, that top of that deal is pretty, you know, flat where you can hit something. When you look at the bottom of their jaw, they got that tongue in the middle and they got 2 big grooves, and it's just all bone, you know, in that outer jaw mandible, right? It's harder to stick a hook in that jaw mandible than it is in that soft palate up above.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it got me, you know, a higher hook percentage. So I was like, okay, you know, obviously if it's you and me and we're playing the game and you're catching 2 and I'm catching 6, obviously I'm catching 6 with that, you know, hook and fish in the top of the mouth. The other advantage to that is a lot of times it's a lot easier to get a fly out.
Right. Yeah.
You know, when you stick that bottom jaw and you put it in that bone, it's hard to get a fly out of
it. It is. Yeah. So, and you can really damage a fish that you intend to release that way, you know. Yeah, for sure. So I know we've talked about this, and you sometimes will throw a 9-weight, but if you were going to line somebody out, if somebody came to you and said, hey, Neil, I want to get into pike fishing, what setup do you recommend as far as rod and line and leader setup? Like, what's just the basics to go out and give them a shot somewhere?
I usually tell people that if you're an experienced fly fisherman, but you haven't fished for large fish, like on the salt water, like some of us do.
Right.
I would say an 8-weight rod would get you, you know, every pike 35 and under easily. Catching a fish over that in the 40-inch range would be a little bit Western because you are a little bit undergunned. You can't stop that fish with that 8-weight I throw a 9. I even throw 10s. I know guys that throw 11 weight rods. The reason why I've thrown a 10 is twofold. Because number one, I'm targeting large fish a lot of the time, where I'm not targeting numbers. Number two is I can cast into the wind. Take that bigger rod with that heavier line and a huge fly, and I can punch into a 15, 20 mile an hour wind and still make 30, 40 foot casts with it. And then secondarily, if I do hook large fish, I can keep them from going into weeds. I can control them.
Exactly, right.
I can make that fish do something that it may not want to do initially. And a lot of times, too, with that heavier rod, I can make that fight a lot less of a period of time. I can control the fish, get her up, have her make a mistake at the boat, because pike have that bad habit where they'll do one or two good runs, right? Those bigger fish especially, they'll kind of tank for a second. And a lot of guys, that's when you lose those fish. You get them up to the boat, here comes this pike, and she's, she'll turn on her side, and she's flapping a fin at you. She's kind of in that first kind of
waving the flag.
I always joke, she's kind of, you think, okay, yeah, she's giving up. It's like, no, she's literally in shock, trying to figure out what just happened. And now you've solidified it by dabbing a net at her.
Right.
And then it's on, fight's on, right? She's going to take off. It's like the tarpon thing. I used to describe that with tarpon. Hook a tarpon. If you can get it in fast before it hits its second wind, right? There's kind of a window where that fish will make 4 or 5 really big runs, and then she'll kind of gas.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the same thing. I always treat it to being in shock, like what just happened? What is going on? They're kind of sitting there, kind of stunned a little bit, like, wow, I'm attached to something that I wasn't attached to before. How am I attached? This is weird. But they don't have that thought process that they can't get away until they realize they can't get away, right? And I always joke, it's like, then they panic. And those big pike especially, I mean, I've had several of them at the boat where I get them all unhooked. I get them in fast, so that I've got them inside that window before they get their second wind. Get them in, go to take a picture of them, and they go just bat crazy.
Right.
And I've not gotten pictures of a lot of those fish because I am like, get it out of the boat.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's not poke its eye out. Let's not let it bash its head against the bottom of the boat. Let's not let it bite us.
Yeah.
Because it's got bigger teeth than those little guys. And not to mention the fact, I mean, if you've ever had a big pike hit you in the head with its head when it starts trying to do head shakes, you have not lived, because you will be seeing stars.
Right, right.
The other thing I've seen those big fish do when they do that, I use a mouse spreader, and I've actually got a couple of them that I've modified where the curves come up and they're pointed, and I'm always afraid those will poke through fish, right? Their jaws and stuff when I'm trying to get flies out. So I took them and put wine corks on them.
Oh, that's smart.
Drilled a hole and slid it in there, and I cut the wine cork off so I can put it in there. Twofold, that wine cork will stick in those teeth.
Right.
And not come flying out. If you don't do that with a mouse spreader, you get a larger fish and you hold it by a gill plate and try and do that, and they decide to shake, they can shoot a mouse spreader a long ways. And the other thing you got to have in your head is that you're downrange. I had one do it to me in Canada. This would have been 20 years ago. Hit me right between the eyes. And I sat there. The fish got away. I luckily had the fly out at that point, but when she decided to shake, that thing hit me. I mean, I probably got a concussion out of that deal. I mean, it hit me dead center. Of course, here's this metal piece of piece of metal, right?
Lesson learned.
Yeah, but for most people, like I said, an 8 would get them by. If you're going to purposely target large fish, I would tell you to definitely, don't go undergunned. Definitely get something that's a little bit easier for you. And now half the rods they make, the difference between an 8 weight and a 10 weight, overall weight of rod casting it is what, an ounce?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. The 9s and 10s are pretty light in the hand these days.
And they throw just as good as an 8. I mean, that was the thing a long time ago. I remember going to fly shows and stuff. Guys like, if you want to cast for distance, you're throwing a 6 weight rod, or a 7 weight rod. And then if you want to be dainty, you're going down to a 5 and a 4. There's guys out there that can throw a 5 weight just as far as they can throw a 7 weight.
Right. Yeah.
Pretty easily, right? Now the rods are so much faster. The actions are so much different. If you're going to spend the money, I mean, an 8 weight and a 10 weight, there's no real difference usually in cost per se. If you're buying, depending on what range of rod you're buying. Reels, you're rarely putting pike into backing. I mean, there will be some, and depending on where you catch them, that will do that. But I mean, I probably have had in the last 5 years, I probably had about 3 fish that I've actually, had to put, that I had into backing. there's probably only about 20 fish that I actually had to put on a reel.
Right.
9 times out of 10, I can just strip them in, right? Larger fish, I will try and get on a reel just because they're so herky-jerky and they have the ability to just do things that other fish don't do. They change direction super quick. So having them on a reel helps. But I don't think that's the prerequisite. You don't have to have a $500 reel to do it.
Yeah.
Pretty easy.
And floating line gets you by for the
floating
majority.
line will get you by for if you're a fair weather fisherman, you're going to fish the high percentage window. You're going to fish May, June. Floating line will do everything you need to do, right? If you are super serious, then you're looking at other lines. You can do sink tip lines. I do intermediate sink lines.
Do you like those striper lines, or which lines?
I've actually gone to. I started fishing some striper stuff the last couple of years. And
I like
really. Good.
I like those lines too. My buddy and I started using those kind of just by happenstance a few years ago.
Yeah, they're designed. They are. I actually the other line that I really liked that I got a few years ago was an SA line. They built it for redfish.
Yeah, that's a good line. Yeah,
that was for cold water redfish.
Right.
That was great. That's the other thing when you do the intermediate lines, you got to kind of watch that because some of them are set up for cold.
Right.
Or
tropical.
Steelhead salmon, or they're tropical.
Right.
You get the tropical one, you go out in March, and the thing's going to be pig-coiled, pigtail on the bottom of the boat. You can never get it straightened out.
That's why that striper line and that redfish line are just about, you're really kind of in the same water temp zone as you are for pike for the most part.
And they're presenting flies the same way that we would for pike. I mean, a lot, they're fishing medium to skinny water. They're throwing, big streamers. They're fishing mid-bottom, and I mean, the great thing about that too is you got to think about it when you fish a floating line, you got a leader, right? You got a fly that sinks, or you got a fly on top. If your fly sinks, right? When you strip it, your fly line's on the surface and your fly is down below on the end of that leader. The leader doesn't float 9 times out of 10. It sinks, right? Mm-hmm. So when you strip this fly, it's a lot more up and down motion. So when you strip it, just the drag of that fly line on the surface will bring that fly up. So when you strip the fly, it's now coming up and sinking down. So it's a lot of that, I always call it a chopping action, right? The fly's going up and down and up and down. And for small, medium pike, they love that. That's their favorite thing. And that thing's trying to get out of the weeds and get away from them. Let's eat it. Bigger pike follow stuff more. And I'm sure you've seen it, when you're stripping flies. Big pike will take stuff differently than little pike. They're more tactitious in the aspect of that they'll follow and then wait for a window where they get the best window where they know they can engulf whatever it is they're chasing, right? Little pike is they'll just throw their body at it. Mm-hmm. They don't care, right? That's open your mouth and take a shot at it. If we miss it, we miss it. No biggie. Big pike will line up and go, okay, what's the 100%? I'm going to get in the 6 o'clock load, just like a fighter pilot does. Mm-hmm. And this thing doesn't know I'm there, and I'm going to close to the closest distance I possibly can. And that thing is at 6 o'clock, slightly high over the bill. All that fish really has to do is jut its bottom jaw, open its top jaw, and pull water through its gills, and whatever it's following goes in. Mm-hmm. And it's unsuspecting. It has no clue that it's going to get eaten. So, it's gone. Mm-hmm. So those bigger pike, when you're stripping that, and you have a lot of that, chopping action or herky-jerky action, that fly's going up. Those bigger fish will follow up, and they will just stop. Once it goes to a certain depth, like, okay, that's too shallow. I'm not going up near the birds. You're going to get me. Whereas those slow-mo lines present more horizontally. You have more left and right action on fly a lot.
Interesting.
And I've noticed that with a lot of my patterns is that when I fish on a floating line, I get that, that hop action with a floating line. And then with the intermediate sinking lines, I get a lot more left and right.
That's interesting that you say that. Okay.
And I think sometimes, like I said, when those fish, when they're in a more neutral mood, they'll follow. And when they're in more on mood, they're going to hit it no matter what it is. If it gets in the strike zone, they're going to hit it. But if they're a little neutral, having that fly going back and forth and allowing that fish to kind of line up and get into that position, that 6 o'clock position to take a bait, will get more strikes. Mm-hmm. And I kind of learned that from, there's a guy, Popovic, that used to do a lot of saltwater patterns.
Oh, yeah, Greg Popovic.
Mm-hmm. And matter of fact, I copied some of his stuff when he was doing steelhead, or when he was doing striper flies, because he does a lot of
surf candy or something.
He does surf candy and stuff, and I was like, God. And of course, that was the first thing he said was these are so much more durable. And of course, they were dealing with where they had they were dealing with rockfish, striped bass, but they also had a lot of bluefish. Where they were
toothy critters.
Teeth. Yeah, back to teeth again, right?
Yeah.
So the epoxy and teeth are a good combination, in which you're not wrecking flies, and you can get a good pattern. When you tie that fly, you can weigh it right. You can shape those heads. right? And for a lot of years, that was something that took me forever, was trying to get the right, find the right shape ahead. And I found like that teardrop, but with a slightly bigger back end, almost like a bell, seemed to just give a better action. Like when we were talking about with that intermediate line, when I'd strip that fly, if I had just a really pointed fly, I got a lot less side to side movement.
Gotcha.
The more belled out I did to the back, the more rounded, kind of a bullet shaped head that I got by rounding the back. I got a lot more left and right action out of that fly. And that, that triggered more fish. So we're back to that.
More bigger fish.
Yeah, more bigger fish.
Yeah.
So transmitting that to anybody that's out there fishing, it's like there's you can do this, and you can do it easy, and you can catch numbers.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a big fish guy like me, because I've kind of graduated from numbers, don't get me wrong, I love catching pike, lots
sure,
of them, right? But when I know I can go to a spot and go, okay, this is, it got to me for a while to be, it's a 9-hole golf course. I'm going to go on this weed bed and catch those 12. Go to that weed bed and catch those 6. And there was a 7th one there I didn't know about.
Right.
And go that and run numbers. And it was great. And how many pike did you catch? I don't know, 50?
Yeah.
Right. I know I had days years ago, like Salmon Lake was, it's frustrating to me now because, it's been fished a lot now and the numbers are way down. But that lake, you go there in the afternoon and catch, I don't know. I mean, there was days where we were catching 100 pike a day.
Yeah.
And let them go.
A lot more ice fishermen up there too.
That's the one limiting factor to pike is people, right? People go in, they don't know what they're doing to the fishery. And I know that I talk to a lot of Trout Unlimited guys and they all bitch about, pressure. Pressure's huge. And we're seeing more and more and more pressure on all our fisheries. The only thing that I think trout have an advantage on is the fact that they will fill every niche in the system. And pike kind of have started to do that, but I don't think they've adapted in the same way in the aspect of that they'll be in water that, that other fish can't tolerate. Trout, they can go in a lot of different places if the water temp's right, they can be anywhere, right? And pike are pretty, like I said, there's big windows of opportunity to catch them where they are just gullible as sin.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't see trout do that.
Right.
One, because there's not enough of this one fish doing this one thing that makes them targetable. And there are movements. I mean, in the years that I fish trout, and I still fish trout, there's pre-spawn deals for trout, and you can catch the living snot out of rainbow trout in certain drainages around here if you know what that timing is. If you know they're pre-spawn, because they'll move into locations and just
go on the feedback.
Oh yeah, whatever goes by them, they're going to pick it up, right? And you see that when the rainbow trout spawn, the brown trout do that, where they come up and they're picking off eggs, and they're picking off whoever else is coming up to eat eggs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's always a pre-spawn, post-spawn deal that makes fish vulnerable. But the pikes, for some reason, even the giant ones, I mean, they can be incredibly smart. They come out of winter, and it was like someone flipped a switch where they don't look at stuff anymore. They don't give a crap that it's got a big, stainless steel leader sticking out of it. If it's dead and on the bottom, they pick it up.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's a big streamer and it goes in front of them, they haven't seen one in 6 months, it goes in their mouth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're just super gullible. So it's easy for one or two individuals that know what they're doing to just go into a spot and just schwack everything in.
Take out the big age class and the spawners.
And and I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, none of us, go to take pictures of little fish. We try not to, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're a fisherman and you've been doing it for a little bit, you want a picture of a bigger fish. You want a 20-inch rainbow. You want a 24-inch brown trout. That's the epitome of this sport, right? And the bad thing with pike is that those bigger fish, once they're gone, I mean, the age class of fish here is, our growing season for them is huge. It takes a fish to attain 40 inches. It probably takes 10, 12 years minimum.
Yeah.
In most of our fisheries. And some of our fisheries is 15 or 20 years to get to that size. So you figure, even though there's a ton of pike in the system, and you and I go out and we catch this 30-incher that's probably a 4-year-old fish.
Mm-hmm. And
we go, oh God, there's pike in here, they're going to eat everything. It's like, it's going to take another 15 years for that fish to get to that 40, 45 inch size. So when you kill that fish, and you got to remember those big fish they're like the 1%ers, right? They're the ones that make it through all the, I mean, if you've been anywhere near a pike fishery, how many ospreys do you see out here picking off pike?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it used to be, when I grew up here, it was ospreys and eagles, targeting kokanees. most of the fisheries I go to now, they're targeting pike. They're eating small pike. That's what they target, right?
Easy to get.
Yeah. So it takes so much longer to get that fish to that size. And even with big trout, it's the same thing here. For trout, I mean, trout grow to certain sizes. It takes probably half that time to attain the adult size fish. The other thing with that too that I see a lot is that recruitment numbers, right? If you had a fishery that had no large fish in it, doesn't matter if it's trout, doesn't matter if it's bass, doesn't matter if it's pike. If you take those large fish out that are predating on the population that they're creating, you create a fishery that's upside down. In other words, you have lots of young fish, no adult fish eating young fish, right? So you see when they say, I always see it when they talk about trout numbers per mile. There's 4,000 trout per mile, right? I remember in years past when Pike first got in the Clark Fork, and of course they were all saying, there's so many trout. At that time there was, I think, around Clark Fork here through Missoula was anywhere from about 850 to maybe 1,000 fish per mile. And I remember them saying, we get pike in the system, that'll go, drop 50%, right? And I kind of kept track of that through that time period. And I noticed that now that same fishery has 4 times the amount of trout. So that those numbers, I think I can't remember what Clark Fork is now, but it's considerably larger than that for numbers of fish. So if these things were killing all of those, why do we have more?
It's a good question.
That's a question I always ask them. Well, they're killing everything. Well, okay, well, look at the numbers from 20 years ago. Look at the numbers from now and tell me if there's more trout in that system now. We're not releasing anymore. We stopped planting most of our rivers 40 years ago with trout. So it's not like they're getting supplemented. Those fish are surviving. They're doing just fine, and this fish is in the system. And with the rivers, the great thing about it is that those pike will only inhabit certain locations. And there's always one more location that nobody hits. So there's always, they've been in all the creel studies that I saw. If you ever want a really fun read, you can go online and go onto Fish Life and Parks webpage, and they have a data section. They just call it data now. And you can go in there, you pick your body of water, and you can basically see all the reports from all the fisheries biologists from when they were started keeping records on paper to now. And you can go back, like on the Clark Fork, because someone asked me this years ago, like, how long a pike was in the system? Oh, not that long. So I started, I'm like, I'm going to, one night I was bored, didn't want to tie any more flies. And I go, I'm going to go on here and look and see how long, how far back were fisheries biologists, recording these fish. And there's one guy, and I can't remember his name, but it was right before they built the dam in Knoxon. And they do a fish survey. They were doing one in the spring and one in the fall. And I think it was 54. He does the thing, pike, present, right? And then I started looking like, okay, I'm going to look at this every 2 years they do the study all the way up to now. And 54 is a long time ago, right? So people that say, the pike are in there now, they're going to take over that fishery. Well, if they haven't done it since 1954 to now, 2022.
1954.
They probably aren't going to do it. I mean, unless we create something, in the system. If we put too much fertilizer in the water, or the water temp comes up, and there's a huge one, right? Everybody's like, water temp in all these rivers is coming up, and trout populations are starting to have issues, right? Circling back to the stunting thing, small fish can take warmer water than large fish. Be it trout, be it northern pike, minnow, squawfish, the suckers that are in that river, whitefish that are in those systems. When we see that water temp come up, populations of fish increase, but size goes down. And then once the size goes down to a certain point, and there's so many small fish, you stack the deck to get a big fish, right? So those 1%ers are now 0.5%ers that get to those sizes, right? So be it a big trout, be it a big, bull trout, whatever, that's what probably killed more bull trout off in these systems, is the fact that we went through and targeted a lot of those large fish. We lost that adult population, the 1%ers, right? So now, same thing with them, it takes them probably 10, 15, 20 years to attain those sizes. That's how long it's going to take when we take one out to replace it with one, right? And then we stack the deck against them by putting so many more fish in the system and utilizing all the food sources that are in that system. Those fish don't have the ability to grow because they're not getting the nutrient base to get to those large sizes, right? And pike are just one of those things where they've been in the system a little less time, But they are, like I said, because of the way that they feed and the way they do things, it's more noticeable in their populations at a rapid pace, right? Every fishery we have in western Montana, with the exception of maybe one or two, are all, fish that were got there by bucket biology, or they got in the system somewhere else and they move. The reason why pike move in most of these systems is because the place where they're born hits a carrying capacity, and there's not enough food.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fish leaves. It's just like you and me. It's like, okay, we don't like being around, lots of people in Missoula, so we're going to go somewhere else to get away from people.
Sure.
Where there's better resources, so they move. And the funny thing is, like, when they got in, I remember when they got in the Clark purposes, where he's like, oh, they're going to go all the way up to Warm Springs, and they're going to go all the way down to, the Columbia, right? Those fish have definitely gone downriver, but not a lot of them have gone upriver.
Right.
And the reason being is because it's harder for those fish to find better niches further up the system than down the system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with trout, there's some of that too, where there's not great habitat for those fish to spread out. But when you see trout numbers, everybody seems to think that, the health of a river is numbers of fish.
Right. Yeah. Good point.
And it's not. And that's something that I think has been fostered by in a lot of places by a lot of people that probably haven't done done more research on it to go, hey, it's like, this fishery could carry, 10,000 fish. However, if we do put 10,000 fish, or we get 10,000 fish in this fishery, what are those fish going to look like? If we put that many in there, they're all little because there's not enough food to get them to the next size.
Mm-hmm.
I see it in a lot of lakes with kokanees. Kokanees are a huge one for that. Kokanees, the first couple of years of their life, and for most of their life, when they swim and they're breathing, they're filtering out plankton out of the system. That's a nutrient food for them. As they get to be larger adults, then they start targeting insects, other fish, stuff like that as a food source, right? Well, when you put more and more and more of a fish that filters plankton into a system, there's less plankton, so those fish don't attain sizes. They don't grow.
Well, Neil, I've taken up enough of your time, man. So Bite Me Flies. It's
Bite Me Flies, yeah.
BiteMeFlies.com.
Yeah, BiteMeFlies.com. You can reach me there. In the process of redoing a website, doing some other stuff, and hopefully I get that up and running. When I do that, I'm going to start doing some classes and stuff on there too. So if you guys have questions, definitely fire them at me. Set up some stuff and get more people in the fish. So
great. And what's the best way for folks to reach you too?
Just email me at bitemeflies.com.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you. This has been just an awesome conversation, and you're such a wealth of knowledge on all fisheries and pike as well. So just really good chatting with you, and I learned a lot here. So insider stuff, man. Thanks again, Neil.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks.
Go to thefebruaryroom.com, where you can access a complete library of our podcast and read more about our guests, their fishing stories, and favorite fly patterns. We're always looking for exceptional fly fishing yarns, and if you have one to spin, shoot us an email at info@thefebruaryroom.com. The February Room is always free, but if you feel like throwing a nickel in the pond, we appreciate any additional listener support. For companies and individuals interested in sponsorship opportunities, please contact us for our media kit. Thanks for stopping by the February Room, and we'll see you down here next week.